Cultural economics. He has spent approximately half of his career conducting research and teaching in Asia. He served for 13 years as head of economics, social science division at the International Rights Research Institute in Los Baños, Philippines, from 1966 to 78 and 2007-2008. He also taught a short course once a year from 1999 to 2004 in agricultural development to 60 mid-career Vietnamese students in the Harvard Fulbright Economics teaching program in Saigon. He is currently retired at Cornell, but regularly spends 4 months a year doing research in Asia and Philippines, his second home where he is IRRI Emeritus. Now, I would like to give the floor to Randy.
First, thanks to Gina for reminding me that I had a seminar this afternoon. I was worried because all the people that run this place are down in Davao at a workshop for secretary. And then I want to thank Tina because poor Tina, I think she's assigned to introduce me because she's the youngest person in the team. Yeah, I don't know, is that right? Poor Tina, she had to go around and ask, who is this guy? She wandered around, but I don't know where he's from. So, she finally found out some data and so forth like that. Now, the other thing, I see that Val has come in late. Now, one of the things is the first slide I'm going to show you. I'm going to point it out. This is a pretty lousy slide, but I take pictures occasionally of myself because my family wants to know, what am I doing? What am I doing over here? I got a whole bunch of emails recently saying, how are you? Are you alive? Oh my gosh. So I had to go outside and take a picture of myself out here in the sun and send it to my folks to show that I was really okay. You know how it is. It's kind of difficult, So now I want to show you that this is me, you can see, but this guy here behind the flowers, that's Bo Tong Sun. Now, if you really want to know something about Vietnam, Bo Tong Sun is the guy to talk to. I don't know how many of you know him. Anybody know him here? Okay, Bo Tong Sun was my next door neighbor when I came to the Philippines in 1965. And so we were, for about 5 years together, we were in Cornell and the Upco and stuff like that. And Sun is a remarkable kind of guy. He's actually won the Magsaysay Award here in the Philippines. He's a good friend, and as I say, he's been on in Vietnam on the council, the state council and so forth. So if you ever want to know anything about what's going on in Vietnam, talk to this guy, Bo Tong Sun. And if you need his email, I can give it to you. Okay, now, this is Vietnam. It's a property map of Vietnam, and it's just to show you roughly what the country looks like, and of course where the poverty is high in the high areas and the upland areas. These are the minority tribes mostly in this upper area. Here's the Mekong Delta in Saigon. Here is the Red River Delta. This area in here is Da Nang and Hue, and so forth. So this is just to give you an idea of the country we're talking about. And you can see that one of the difficulties, they had the same difficulty we have here in the Philippines. We're spread out on islands. They're spread out from the north to the south, and there's a huge difference geographically and physically and everything, north-south. And the interesting thing here is, even after the war, the Northerners and Southerners, it's like our Civil War. You know, if I go down to the South and I walk into a store, they can tell by the way I dress that I'm a carpetbagger from the North, even today. So it's kind of like that in Vietnam, that the Southerners are one thing and the Northerners are another, and they talk to each other, but they have a different culture and a different philosophy, the same way we do in the U.S., a different culture and a different philosophy. And that affects the difficulty of having, say, a rural development program that is sort of homogeneous for the country as a whole. It's usually geographic. Okay, now one of the things to understand, I'm going to do a little bit of history, but the point to understand is that most changes that occurred in Asia were the result of a revolution and land reform. And this is true beginning with following Japan after World War II, that the MacArthur people developed a land reform. Taiwan, land of the tiller, the nationalists who came into Taiwan reallocated the land to be sure that the land was owned by the tillers. China, decollectorization, which you're all familiar with. And here, Vietnam, 10 years after China, more or less the same Doi Moi change in 1987, and the land law and decollectorization. So you have a kind of a history, and we had our own land reform one way or another here in the Philippines. It's still going on. I think they've just now decided to divide Luisita and give it back to the people. We thought they were going to do that when not Ninoy, but his wife was going to divide the land and give it back to the people. But they've now just decided to do that in Luisita, in central Luzon. So land reform is a continuing problem. And I'll show you that it's continuous. One of the things about the theme and about the conference is that how central land reform is still to Vietnam and to Asia in general. Doi Moi, 1980s to 1990s. And this just shows you a sequence of events. Beginning, what was happening in here is, up until now, the Vietnamese were importing rice. And in the 1980s, right in here, there was a real crisis. And there was talk about starvation in the north. And there was talk about unrest in the south, political unrest in the south. And it's nothing like a good storm or a good something to get people doing something different and making a change. So back in here, they decided they were going to, the land law was going to give land to the people. Now, when they say give land to the people, they gave land use rights. They did not give the land per se, but they gave land use rights. And this is going to be one of the problems I'm going to talk about later. The state owns the land. The state still owns the land. But the state land use rights are with individual families. And the land use rights are very different in the north and the south, because in the north, what they did is they gave, if you're a farmer, you got, you say you had a hectare of land or something like that, 1/3 would be high quality, 1/3 middle quality, 1/3 poor quality. Now you can imagine the farms spread out all over the place. So now we need to collect it instead of decollectivize everything. So, and the next thing that happened was, of course, liberalization of the market. You see, Maddie's not here to talk about markets. I'm talking about liberalization of the market, but Alice will tell them what I talked about. Won't you, Alice? No? Anyway, So, and then there's a bit of revisions to the land law, and the latest land law is in 2003. And I'll talk later about the fact that its land law in 2003 was supposed to expire in 2013, this year. And this is a big problem. Now, managing the water in the Mekong Delta. One of the things that really led to the development of Vietnam in this period was the ability to increase rice exports by managing the water. And you see this tremendous growth in rice exports. So now Vietnam is the #2 world's exporter of rice. Now, not all Vietnamese are happy about this because some people figure that you don't, being the highest exporter of rice doesn't mean that you're naturally the best developed country. Usually it means something else. So there's a lot of people think that maybe they ought not to be doing this, but they ought to be growing high quality rice because they can't compete, at least in terms of quality, with the people from Thailand. Now, how did they get there? This is a map of the Mekong Delta in about 1975, and the one thing you want to see here is we have deep water area, the plain of reeds and so forth like that up next to the Cambodian border. The deep water area, I'll show you in a minute, the water goes up to the height of the ceiling during the flood. And rice has what they call an elongating gene, so that the rice can grow as the water comes. The rice can grow about 5 centimeters a day to keep up with the water. Now, down here is the saline area. We'll talk more about the saline area because both of these are related to, you'll see pretty soon that I'm beginning to talk about not only markets, but global climate change. You know, one of the things that's nice about, somebody said, what's happening in Vietnam? I said, well, you know, the same thing is happening here. If you want to talk to people, they're going to talk to you about two things. Value chain and global climate change. And even my Harvard friends talk about global climate change. And the people in Colombia have a project here in the Philippines, in the Bicol, to worry about global climate change and managing. They established this project before this Leyte affair. They must be wondering now what they're doing in the Bicol. But the point is that you have the donors get every 10 years get an idea, and every 10 years is a new idea. But this 10 years, it's value chain and global climate change. And not to say that these aren't important, but there are some people that are better qualified to do global climate change than others, and so forth like that. So, but now, as I say, the Harvard people are trying to do global climate change in the lower Mekong Delta, and I don't think it'll work very well. Now, deep water. You see, okay, I cheated here. Those of you that are smart will know that that lady is not Vietnamese. Where is she from? Where is she from? Thailand. Even Val knows. She's from Thailand. What's the mess with the rest of you people? You don't get out. Get out. Okay. Anyway, that's deep water. And this is kind of what they had is a dike system, and what they did basically to increase, to control the water in the Mekong was with a dike system and with pumps. But they had essentially created, let's say, a dike around this whole area, and they could let the water in or keep it out with the walls of the dike. And they could get a rice crop before the flood and a rice crop after the flood. So instead of getting 2 tons that this lady was getting, they are now getting 4 tons twice a year. And that area that you saw, this area up here, basically there are 4 provinces in the upper Mekong here in Vietnam that account for basically all of the exports of rice in Vietnam. Just those 4 provinces like IRRI and so forth like that. Now, the other side of the coin is down at the ocean side. They also did some things there. Here you'll notice that if you follow this, that there was a program to introduce these barriers to keep the salinity out, okay? The salt water so that rice could be protected. So they started this is the World Bank project. They started in 1994, so all the way down here to 2000. And almost a decade, they built these barriers to keep the salt water out. Now, what happened next? They discovered that the shrimp were more valuable than the rice. So they had to open some of these barriers to let the salt water back in. Now, it's interesting because the whole question of diversification of shrimp and rice is very important in the Delta. And you know, I got this Vietnamese newspaper the other day, and it caught my eye because the headline of the Vietnamese says, and this is before the typhoon, the headline says, VN seals Philippine rice contract. Oh, we're importing rice already? I thought we were self-sufficient. No. Anyway, but then the next article is shrimp exports enjoy high turnover. And what's interesting is that shrimp is a very risky business. A lot of people, including the Taiwanese and so on, have lost their shirts on disease and infection with shrimp. But now they have something called a white leg shrimp, which is replacing the giant tiger prawns. And the white leg shrimp is resistant to this disease. Interesting. So that opens up an opportunity for diversification in these farms in Drilon. But this is always kind of curious to me how you say you do something and all of a sudden it's the wrong thing to do. Okay, now challenges for the future. Land reform. The farm size, state-owned land. Okay, the problem here, and the problem is throughout much of Asia, is this. The land reform is expiring. And the land reform stipulates that 2 things. One is you can only have 3 hectares of land in the Mekong and 2 hectares of land in the Red River in the north. And the land reform also says that certain lands are to be designated for rice. You can't grow crops other than rice on those lands, okay? And part of that reason is that the exporters have a lot of power. The state-owned industry exporters have a lot of power. And this whole question of control of the rice exports. Basically, the rice exports are controlled by the government, not by private trade. And so when the rice, a few years ago, there's an article I gave some of you that they actually banned rice exports from Vietnam during the rice crisis. The government just shut off. The question is, why did they do that? Was it to get higher prices, or was it to protect the local industry? I don't know, but it was not. A number of studies, one of which came up in our conference, showed that if you had a free market, that you helped the poor people. One of the problems in the land in the exports in those 4 countries I said were major exporters and so forth, that what they've done is they have been able to gather together and synchronize the farming of a handful of farmers. In other words, almost like violating the law, which says you can only have 3 hectares. They got together and pooled, and the exporters provide the credit. It's a contract relationship. It's a kind of, the exporters provide the credit. Writes a little bit of the what do you call it, land reform in the Philippines with the landowner and so forth like that. Well, the landowner in this case is the exporters, and they have apparently done it. But the problem that friends tell me is that there are a lot of people that are left out of this. There's a lot of poverty in this area, despite the fact that they are actually doing well in producing rice and so forth. Now, another thing about rice exports is this, and I was talking a little bit with Alice the other day, quality. The Vietnamese always have been saying for 10 years, we need to improve quality so we can compete with the Thais, okay? Now, the problem, it seems to me, is this, is that quality rice like jasmine is grown in a rather specific environment, and it's not very high yielding. And the environment that they grow jasmine is in the northeast Thailand, most of which is not irrigated. I don't think you can grow the same quality rice, like jasmine rice, in the Mekong Delta. So that's something that I think we need to talk with breeders about what they can do and what they can't do about aromatic rice and stuff like this. But it seems to me that this is a problem in terms of quality. So there's a certain unhappiness with the fact that Vietnam's rice sells at a lower price than, say, particularly the Thais or other people do that. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this graph because I think it's a useful graph, and this was, I have a series of graphs like this for I'll show you the Philippines and Taiwan and so forth, but I need to explain a little bit about what the importance of this graph is. This is GDP down here, and this is the labor force. Generally speaking, roughly, it's very hard to measure the labor force in agriculture. Some countries do it one way, some do it another, but generally speaking, the labor force in agriculture is about twice the GDP in agriculture, which reflects the fact that productivity of labor in agriculture is lower than that in the non-agricultural sector. So the question then is, you come down to here, and some things begin to happen down in about here. And I'll show you that there are several countries that are in this particular mode right here. And the question is this. 2 things. One is production. Am I going to continue to produce rice in small farms of 1 hectare or something like that? Or am I going to increase the size? Now, think of Asia. In Taiwan, Korea, and Japan, they've gone to small farm size. They've subsidized agriculture. The farm sizes in these countries are a hectare or so. But other countries, including China now, are going the other direction and enlarging their farms to take advantage of mechanization. And part of the question of whether you can do this is how fast the non-farm sector is pulling labor out of agriculture. And one of the tragedies of the Philippines is very slow. Let me show you the next one. This is Taiwan and this is the Philippines. They start about the same place back in 1960, and everybody figured, well, Taiwan and the Philippines were going to take off. Well, Taiwan took off, but the Philippines didn't. And it's not because of agriculture, it's because the non-farm sector was not employed. You know, the Philippines missed the Industrial Revolution. And I guess we were put it on the hands of the sugar bloc, which controlled most investments in that country up until the Marcos period, and not putting enough emphasis on industrialization and export for industrialization, whereas Taiwan was export-oriented from the beginning. And so this is what happened. And of course, in addition to this, the Philippines has that heavy load of being population growth rates of 2%, which are the highest in Asia. So you have that double backing up of people in the rural area, and except for those that migrate to Hawaii or somewhere else, overseas workers is a major source of income here in the Philippines. It's related to this. Now here in Taiwan, by 1975, a little bit later, they went from taxing agriculture in here, they taxed agriculture, because you have to tax agriculture in the early stages of development because it's just a big part of the economy. So you tax agriculture to develop industry. And back here, they were taxing agriculture with something called the fertilizer rice barter ratio. They were charging farmers too much for the fertilizer and using that money to develop the non-farm sector. So then they come down here, and about this time, they turn around and they're subsidizing agriculture. They're subsidizing, and they've been subsidizing the irrigation. Nobody pays for the irrigation. Nobody pays all this stuff in agriculture. Now, China also now is ahead of Vietnam. The Chinese are subsidizing agriculture, particularly rice production and so forth. They're moving in that direction, and I don't know enough information about where they are at the moment. I don't have a chart like this for China, but it's clear to me that the Chinese GDP has gotten down to below this 10 or at the 10% level where things are going to happen. Now, the other thing that to talk about is rice quality and who's going to consume this rice, because one of the things that's going to happen, two things are going to happen when you get down to here and start changing. First of all, people are going to eat less rice. And I think somebody told me in the Philippines they're already beginning to eat less rice. I don't know. But people start to eat less rice. These people, the Vietnamese are one of the highest consumers of rice in Asia, but the people start to eat less rice, and the people that also demand higher quality for rice. So those two things are going to happen, but they won't all happen at the same time in the same country. So I think these graphs are kind of useful for saying where a country is and what we should be emphasizing at this particular point. Now, this is what, we had, it's always interesting to me. We had a rice-based farming system here, cropping system here at IRRI for I don't know, since the 1960s. And Gene, when do we get rid of the cropping system? You remember? We had it in the infirmary. The headquarters were in the current infirmary. What year did we drop the rice-based cropping system? You know? I don't know. Anyway, it's disappeared.
80s.
What?
Early 80s.
Early 80s? Is that long ago? Anyway, I mean, you see, I think one of the things that we were talking about, these rice-based cropping systems, we were trying to consider people eating something besides rice. We were pushing soybeans. We were doing other kinds of things with a guy called Dick Bradfield. And then Dick Howard after him. We're basically running rice-based systems and looking particularly at the cropping patterns. Now, I always argue that we should be doing something with ABRDC because they're the ones that have the rice-based, that non-rice vegetables. And in ABRDC and IRRI have offices in the same countries next to each other, but they don't work together. But I think that, that's a better path than golden rice in my view. Because I think rather than encouraging people to eat more golden rice, I think that you want to encourage them to eat something besides rice. And I think that's the trend in the future, is that we're going to, I think, see less and less people consuming less and less rice. But anyway, TP told me, and I got a number of comments from other people, and now, this is a contest. It's open to all of you. I want a show of hands. Which country has the highest yield per hectare? Indonesia? No hands. Philippines? Philippines? Oh, we got one hand. Thailand? Vietnam? Okay, and most of you don't know. But you didn't vote. Now let's do that again. Indonesia. Philippines. Thailand. Vietnam. I think Vietnam is sort of the leader. Now let's reverse the project. Who has the lowest yield? Who has the lowest yield? Indonesia? Philippines? Thailand? Vietnam? So you do have a sense that something is amiss in Thailand. We got low yields over there, something like that. Now, normally when I ask this question at Cornell, they have no idea at all. I mean, they've heard that Thailand is the biggest exporter. They must be high yield and so forth like that. Well, let's take a look at what. Let's see the results. There are the results. Okay, so Indonesia. Why is Indonesia at the top?
100% irrigated.
What?
Irrigation. They invested a lot of irrigation. That's why Indonesia.
Okay, there are two things. It's a little bit like Bangladesh. There's irrigation, but also in Java, very small farms, very highly intensified. So, Thailand, what's the farm size in Thailand?
Big. 2.5 to 4.
What?
2.5 to 4 hectares.
Yeah, it's 5 or 6 hectares per farm in many parts of Thailand. So Thai farms are much larger. If you look at the farms and so forth, the Thai farms are large, but now here comes Vietnam, which has been moving fast and is now up with Indonesia, so forth. So now I want to change a little bit and talk about part 2, which is we've talked a little bit about markets. Now we're going to talk about hydropower, global climate change, and I want to give you a little bit of a view of what the problems in this area are. This is the map of the 8 major rivers of the Himalayan region. For example, the Yellow River, the Indus River, the Gangetic River, the Mekong River here, the 8 rivers. 7 of the 8 have their headwaters in Tibet. That's why China is very keen about controlling Tibet. It's about water. And now the Chinese are building a lot of hydropower dams in the upper end. They're looking at using the water partly to a large extent for hydropower and so forth. But remember, these 8 rivers produce the food for about 40% of the world's population. and more than 40% of the world's poor. So this is, this is a major problem. Now, what about the glaciers? What happens if the glaciers melt in the Himalayas? What happens to the water supply? So this is one of the concerns that anybody would have about global climate change. How it's going to impact on these rivers. This is the Mekong. And the question here is, this dam is being built, has been built by the Chinese in Yunnan province. And how does that affect the fishing in the Tonle Sap? Because the question is, how do the releases of water up here affect what's going on down here? And how do you adjust for that? See, and if you ask the people, I asked a class of people in Vietnam, I said, what's the problem? They say the Chinese are the problem. But it's not clear, because until you do the research to see exactly what happens in terms of the releases of water here, maybe they're releasing more water in the dry season. I don't know. But the whole area now, there's something called the Mekong River Commission. The Mekong River Commission consists of the lower Mekong, these countries in here. It does not include Myanmar and China. Mekong River Commission has been meeting since 1954 and has a huge amount of data. But the Mekong, here's the problem. Well, these are a bunch of hydropower dams. Like the measles. Okay, you have 6 countries, and you have 6 different agencies. And you think about it. I mean, each country, these countries don't really like to talk to each other, and these agencies within a country don't talk to each other. Now, one of the things that myself and Pi and Tina DeVito are doing is trying to get something called governance in water management in the Philippines. Just the Philippines, not 6 countries, just the Philippines. And the question is, what's good governance? It's good governance, good for me, maybe bad for you. So it's a really tricky business when you get in here in terms of trying to decide, well, okay, I mean, we know that Manila needs flood control. So each one of these things is a really difficult job. And I think the problem is, I have a theory, and that says that there are too few people that are trained to address this job, and that is because in research, we're specialized. Water management is interdisciplinary. You cannot be specialized. You have to have engineers and economists if you're going to do that. And, I mean, where do you find a university where the engineers and economists talk to each other? They're trained here and trained there and so forth like that. Or where do you have enough trouble here in Erie or whatnot. They're working on mechanization anyway, not water management. But it's a really, really difficult problem when you've got this kind of competition among users. And it didn't used to be that way. Remember, 20 years ago, we didn't worry about this. 20 years ago, it all went to agriculture, 80% of it. And it was fine because the non-farm sector wasn't demanding that water. Now, it's changing dramatically. I borrowed this slide actually from Bob Ziegler, just to emphasize the importance of the deltas. Because the last thing I'm going to say about is what I think we ought to be doing to help in increasing production development. 50% of the rice production in the last 25 years came from delta countries. But one country it didn't come from was Myanmar. This is the IRRI. look at the difference here. 5.3 tons in the Mekong, you saw that. And here, over here, we're talking about 2 tons. This is where I think we ought to be putting, IRRI ought to be putting its effort. Now, I understand. You see, my problem is I'm too old. When I came to IRRI, we had only one mission, increase rice production in Asia. And so, if I want to increase rice production in Asia, I want to worry about that. And so that's the way I think we would increase rice production in Asia. So I think it's something that we ought to think about in terms of the future. Now, there is an effort to do a scoping study and some things like this, but you know, what I'm arguing is that you want to take the people here and put them on a bus and drive them around the Mekong Delta. Because when they see things, they can say, well, that'll work for us, but this won't work. It's the same way with farmers. You take farmers and you scout them around, you want to sell them on something. Oh, this will work for me, but it won't work for you. So my idea is it won't happen because I'm not in charge. But it's to take the people here and let them understand the lessons of what these people have learned about how to manage the water in the Mekong Delta. I don't know what I'm at. I may be at the end. Yeah, I am at the end. That's just an elaboration. Okay, so questions? No questions. Yeah. Oh, Sam, I didn't see you back there.
Yes, I didn't say too much.
Somebody's going to have to translate my
You said all Southeast Asia countries, Vietnam, Cambodia, Myanmar, they're all trying to produce high quality jasmine rice, isn't it? They're all trying to produce high quality rice so they can export jasmine rice.
Well, I just don't, I mean, I talked a lot with Alice about that yesterday, and I think what I find is this. In Myanmar, there's something called pasan. That's a high-quality pasan rice, which won the prize for the best rice in the world. You went to the meeting
Yeah, but
in
I don't
Bangkok,
think that,
okay?
I don't think that's just a completely fake joke. You know, it is just a nice
Well, look,
contest
let me
done by
finish. Let me
people.
finish about pasan.
Yeah.
Pasan in the northern part of Burma and pasan in the Delta are not the same. They're not the same yield. They're not the same quality.
But what I'm saying is there is no demand for pasan right now. Okay?
What?
Pasan, the pasan rice, the one is grown in Myanmar.
Yeah.
There is absolutely no demand in the global market. Nobody will buy that rice for $1,000, maybe at 500, 600.
Well, take
that
it.
doesn't come anywhere close to jasmine.
Well, take jasmine. I don't care.
No, so okay. If you talk about jasmine, Vietnam wants to increase jasmine rice production. But thing is, there is no demand for jasmine rice beyond 4-5 million tons at the price we are selling right now. If we are going to produce 10-12 million tons of jasmine rice, the jasmine price will crash because maybe $600-700, not $1,200-1,300 people are thinking about.
Okay,
There's no
well,
market for jasmine rice at this price. You know what I mean?
yeah, well,
People think at a given price they can supply as much jasmine possible, but that's not the case.
yeah.
Jasmine rice is very price elastic right now, but because it is sold in
Yeah.
the Far East countries, Europe or US.
Well, you just have to see what happens. I don't know. Part of this question is what the breeders think and so forth like that.
But right now you see the 5% broken rice,
Yeah.
which is the white rice, and the spread between 5% and jasmine or basmati is $900, $1,000. This is $400, that is close to
Yeah.
$450.
So you're saying a low quality jasmine?
Well, the white rice.
Yeah.
Our hard rice.
Yeah.
That was jasmine. But the thing is,
Okay.
if we expand jasmine production, that spread is going to get squeezed. The people are not going to get $1,200 per ton. They will get $800, $700, depending on what the supply is.
Okay. Anyway, it's an interesting question and a lot of debate. And I know that the Vietnamese have been trying to do this with, compete with the Thais for quite a while. But, yeah.
I'd like to comment or address your comments about the farming systems research in the past.
Yeah.
It strikes me from that farming systems research that one of the challenges of that research was really to make recommendations that weren't site-specific. The research was conducted over multiple locations, but each location, in terms of the results, become quite specific to the soils, to the climate, to the environment in that particular season and location. And the challenge is how to extrapolate that into making recommendations that are in line with what a farmer in another location could do, in line with markets. So I think that's one challenge, and I'm not certain that research was effective enough in having a predictive ability in terms of helping farmers make decisions. The second thing is we have so many cases that even if you come to farmers and tell them to diversify, they still grow rice because they know how to grow rice. And they don't know how to handle the other crops.
Yeah. Well, the first question is, I remember exactly what you're saying, talking to Dick Harwood about the site specificness of that particular work. And the discussions we had about, at IRRI about that time, about the limitations of that work. Now, what's interesting to me, though, is that, again, why were we doing this in the first place? It was a decade in which U.S. aid and others supported farming systems research everywhere. It wasn't just, I had a farming system project in Leahy for 5 years with U.S. aid support. And that was a time when we all thought, well, that's the thing to do, is to do farming systems. And that's why I say you have these things that last for 10 years and then we move on to something else and don't finish up what we started over here. And one of the things I did learn from this farming systems research, Lady and Samar, is that we could take, they were doing something called alley farming. Remember alley farming? Okay. We could take farmers and show them alley farming, and some farmers would say, I can do that, and others farmers would say, it doesn't make sense in my area, which is just what you're saying. It is very site-specific, and so everybody's pushing alley farming, and now the same thing comes up with alternate wetting and drying. We're trying to say, oh, do alternate, it depends on the site-specific nature of what we're looking at. But yeah, it's interesting, the history of why we got into this and why we got out and what we learned.
So I think that in that context, if one is to promote that type of research in the future, it must be with a much stronger capacity of developing a predictive ability.
Well, I think the question I would say is, I'm not sure the IRRI wants to promote it. I think they might want to see what ABRDC is doing. And maybe, I don't know how successful they are. I don't know enough about, I've been there, but I don't know enough about their outreach to know with vegetables and so forth how well they're doing. I don't know. Yeah.
Thanks, Randy, for that presentation. You just mentioned AWD, and I mean, if I'm putting the dots together correctly, I mean, water shortages are highly likely or a real possibility. So, can you comment on how important you think AWD will be in the future in the Mekong countries?
Yeah, I can give you a paper that I sent out this morning, a review of an article on AWD, and tell you what's wrong with it.
Right.
That's the quickest thing. But the problem AWD is this, that you see, it has to do with what we call real water savings and water balance. You see, if I, for example, if I line a canal, the question is, what happens to the water if I didn't line? Am I taking water from somebody? And the same thing with AWD is you have to look at the system, at the scale, at the watershed, and not just at one farm when you're looking at AWD. But all these people that do AWD, including people in Tarlac, so you see, we're doing AWD in Tarlac, not to save water, but to save fuel costs. You know, they don't care about saving, farmers don't care about saving water. But I think there's going to be more pressure. Governments like the Philippines, Manila's taking water from the Angat system and so forth like that. That the question then is, how are farmers adjusting? Are they going to pumps? Are they doing something else? And I think it's very different. Again, the same thing goes back to the site where you're working. Is that I can see from a different site that will work here. We had 2 sites in China. AWD worked perfectly in one, the other site in the Yellow River, which ought to be saving water, we shouldn't do AWD. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I would just like to know how much of a priority water management is for the Vietnamese government. Do you think it's high on the issue?
Somebody want to repeat? I can't hear you. I have a terrible, most people can't hear me either.
I'd just like to know if the water management is a high priority for the Vietnamese government right now. Because you've been talking about a lot of problems, including climate change and the Mekong River. Do you think the Vietnamese government is proactive at the moment about these problems?
Yeah, well, I think that there's a lot of research going on, and I think when I say to anybody that wants to look at that area, there's been a vast amount of research on the Mekong. For example, so there's been a lot of attention to the water management question. For example, contested waterscapes on the Mekong is a study that addresses a lot of these different issues and so forth. And so I can point you to 2 or 3 important documents that have gone into the detail of anybody who's going to do global climate change ought to read these also in terms of what's already been done, including a lot of that work has been done by T.P. Tong and by Huang over in IRRI. The 2 Vietnamese guys have done a lot of that water management work. And Tong, I guess he comes by here occasionally, but not very occasionally. He's retired. These guys are retiring, that's the problem. But I can show you what you want to look at in terms of, there's a lot of research that's been done that people need to be aware of and not just repeat the same thing.
Not just research, is there like a policy output or anything?
What?
Is there policies?
Well, that's the other problem. You see, you address an important issue, and that is the problem that we have the workshop. And at the end of the workshop, we decide that we ought to do something about the land reform. We ought to do something about the what do you call it, state-owned industries and so forth. But then somebody says, gee, we need to talk to policy people. And the point is that there's a gap everywhere almost between the conversation with the policy people and the conversation with the researchers and so forth. And that's pervasive almost everywhere. Now, one of the things I'll say, Pai Moya and Tina DeVee and I are engaged in a project in which Tina DeVee has been able to talk with policy people. And it's unusual, because it just happens that the guy who was the head of the IRRI, a guy called R.C. Belasakran, who used to be over here at Circa, is a good friend of ours. And so he can open doors that we can't open and so forth. So the whole question of the link between policy and actual research is fundamental in terms of done. And as I say, there are more cases where it doesn't work. People say, yeah, this is what you ought to do, but unfortunately it never gets done. Hi.
Are there any predictions on how sea level rise might affect production in the Mekong and other deltas that you showed on the map?
How what?
Is there any prediction on how much sea level rise might affect
sea level.
the production in the Mekong Delta and the other deltas?
There are two things. One is the sea level rise, but the other is the salinity. Salinity in the sea is increasing. So you have a double problem, and that is how saline is the ocean going to get, and then how it's going to rise. Now, is Val still here? Yeah. Oh, you're over there. What's the answer to that question? He's going to model that. And so I don't know how you arrive at a decision about the future, but let's take it home to the U.S. We had Sandy, and all of a sudden Sandy opened our eyes to the possibilities of global climate change in New York. And instead of coming to the Philippines, those Columbia University people should be looking at global climate change in New York. And the question for us is that they're building a branch of our university at Cornell on an island in New York. And when somebody gives you an island in New York City, you have to ask, well, what's the matter with it? Why are we giving this? The sea might just rise and our site might just disappear before we get the buildings built. So I think we don't really have a lot of judgment. And the other thing is how fast the icebergs are melting, and the same with the Himalayas. How fast this is occurring, I don't know. But I would guess that you could probably predict something out of the Himalayan glaciers in terms of how fast they were melting.
Randy, first of all, that was a very good presentation. My question to you, I've asked you this in the past several times. Every time when you come back, I keep asking you the same question. What do you think should be for us SSD, our research priority in this Mekong?
What do you think should be the what?
Research priorities. What would you suggest to SSD as research priorities?
You see, Sam is left.
You can see.
You see, and what I would say is, like I told you before, is I don't know what I'd do if I were Sam. Because on the one hand, you want to raise money. On the other hand, you want to do relevant research. And it's difficult. I think sometimes, like I say, the money is for global climate change and not for water management. So I don't know what you do. But, I don't know. See, I have to be careful what I say. But anyway, I really enjoy coming back.
Yeah.
And every time I come, I try to give you a seminar. And it's a great privilege for me to come because, I've been telling you, you see, Tina doesn't know who I am, but I've been doing research for 50 years with the same people. This is 1990 publication in Vietnam on the policy analysis of transition to market-oriented economy in Vietnam. Myself, Tina David, and Yajiro Hayami. This is Hayami. He was my classmate at Iowa State. So another guy that I've worked with for years. And here's a guy you don't know, Gil Labine. He's my expert, and he's an engineer at Cornell. And this is 50 years of experience in water management in the Philippines and Taiwan. And we meet twice a week back at Cornell. So I've been lucky that my friends haven't died yet. And I've been able to continue the research. Except for Hayami. So, I mean, that's to me is a great privilege. And then, of course, I should introduce my landlord, Bert, because the other thing is that he and his wife put up with me. And without that, I would go hungry. So I get good service. I invited him because I wanted him to know what I did too, as well as my family. He's part of my family, extended family. And so I wanted him to say, well, now I know what Dr. Bartlett does, or tries to do. So anyway, now anybody wants the PowerPoint, of course that's easy. I can give you the PowerPoint.
So
Okay, let's go have coffee.
yes, coffee and stand outside.